All right, let's go. Okay, we did our project on mass incarceration in the United States. I'm Miles Hassel. We have Phoebe Davidson, Hunter Dale, and Chris Rosario. To start the project, we thought this quote really fit what we were doing and what we're aiming for. It's by William Blackstone, and he said, "It is better that 10 guilty persons escape than that one innocent suffer." So I'll just let you think on that. Um, a little overview. We're going to be talking about what is the probability of a convicted felon being innocent, what about being innocent and on death row, and then what about being innocent and killed on death row. So I'll hand it over to Chris.
So if you look at the graph on the left, so first actually let's give you some historical context. So in 1972, there was a Supreme Court case called Furman v. Georgia, which says that the constitutionality of the death penalty because it was inhumane at the time because we were using fire squads. So it abolished like death penalty for a few years, and then in Greg v. Georgia in 1976, it brought back the death penalty, but with better legislation, and the constitutionality was not challenged on those. So you see a spike in the 1980s and up to the 1990s because of President Reagan and his war on drugs, and also Nixon with his war on drugs, and the public support begins to like die down in the beginning of 2000s. But it was because the fight wasn't being fought with the intensity that it was in the 1980s and 1990s when the war on drugs was like better funded. So you also see a spike in 1998 and 1999 because 44% of those people that had older cases were being expedited and now were being processed in the Supreme Court. And in 2000 to 2002, you see a small spike because all the executions occurred in Texas, one state out of all 49, showing the disproportion that Texas used. Texas is the biggest state, and that uses the death penalty. So Southern Texas accounted for the Northwest, the Northeast, and the Midwest all together for the amount of death penalties that they had, showing you the more developed societal norms that are there in the Northeast, Northwest, and Midwest.
So dealing with all this data, we thought it was very important to talk about sampling bias. So the graphs like this one right here and the other ones that we've evaluated are kind of hard to comprehend in terms of sampling bias due to the fact that there's information that's not explicitly included. For example, we don't know the population or the sample size of the survey or even how the survey was conducted in this case, besides the question that was asked. In this case, the question is, are you in favor of the death penalty for a person convicted of murder? So according to Gallup, this poll has consistently been conducted since 1937 with the same question. That only doesn't give us enough information into the possible bias, but it is a reassuring fact. So Gallup being a fairly reliable poll slash source, we can assume that this information is correct. As for other polls, we can be reassured in the fact that Gallup appears to use truly random samples and rotating questions in order to avoid non-response bias, voluntary bias, and undercoverage bias. When thinking of these graphs, we have to keep in mind the idea of social desirability paired with leading questions that can affect responses. For example, in a 2010 poll by Lake Research Partners, they found that a clear majority of voters, 61%, would choose a punishment other than the death penalty for murder. And yet in this graph right here, if you look at 2010, it's about 60% of people were in favor of the death penalty for a person convicted of murder. From this, we can tell that oftentimes people want to choose the most virtuous or moral answer to be seen positively in the face of the other. And we can only guess what kind of bias may have been included in the Gallup poll or the Lake Research Partners poll. So by using rotating questions as well, Gallup also avoids bias with leading and loaded questions that may seem one-sided. So they don't just have one question for every poll, they have it shown in both lights for possible support or opposition. And then as far as interpreting this graph, with the context Chris provided, you can see the natural dips and rises in favor and opposition of the death penalty. And interestingly enough, in the 1990s, crime within the US was deemed the biggest threat to America. So as a result, the population sought harsher punishment with the death penalty. But yeah, so that's sampling bias.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about these graphs that we chose, mostly because they have a few variables within them. And we talked a lot about graphs with multiple variables within our course. So these are demonstrating the proportions of homicide victims based on the racial and gender identities of both the offender as well as the victims. And so they're you can see how they're color coded to show, for example, how many Black male offenders, how many of their victims were Black females, white males, Black males, etc. So this is something really important to consider when talking about something like the death penalty or our country's problem with mass incarceration as a whole, which is why we included Hispanic individuals make up 60% of the incarcerated population in the United States. But interesting enough, by reading these graphs, we can see that clearly and consistently over time, from the period of 1998 to 2013, homicides in the United States tend to be committed by people of similar race as their victims. You can also see in these graphs that women are rarely the perpetrators. And statistically, they're rarely the victims as well. So this is also important to consider in talking about the death penalty because it is not applied equally across all types of homicides. It really depends on both the race and gender of the offender as well as the race and gender of the victim as to whether or not justice will be pursued and whether or not that justice is interpreted or taken to mean the death penalty. So thank you very much. You can